Hi guys, thank you for joining me for another episode of Wisdom Wednesdays. Today we're going to be talking about bulletproofing hamstrings. Hamstring injuries are the kryptonite of many a footballer and other field sport athletes. So today we're going to be talking about the different mechanisms of injury and ultimately what you can do to prepare yourself or your athletes to reduce their likelihood of hamstring injury. Hamstring injuries happen no differently to most muscular injuries in that the demands of the environment exceed a player's ability to tolerate the stress of that environment. Now, it's important to note that it's so easily done, and this is a mistake I've made in my younger days, is that you'll see a player pull up with a hamstring injury and you'll be like, oh, they weren't doing any hamstring work. If I was there, they would have done this exercise or that exercise. But when I say their ability to cope with the demands of the environment, that's not just the physical training. There's been plenty of research on, for example, how athletes' sleep affects their recovery, how just life stress in general impacts recovery. So it's too simplistic to be like, that athlete has weak hamstrings. Again, if you've got an athlete with, for example, a weak foot, that's going to transfer up the chain. If you've got an athlete with glutes that don't fire effectively, or for example, a running technique that is inefficient, all of these factors are going to increase the load that the hamstring has to deal with. So mechanisms of injury. Again, you've got your bicep femoris and your semitendinosus. Now, without meaning to get too technical, bicep femoris is typically the hamstring muscle that gets injured with high-speed running, and semitendinosus is more likely to be injured in an overstretch type injury. So the reason why this is important is because if you don't have an ability to scan players' hamstrings, let's say you're a Sunday league player or helping your mate's football team out, if you can get a good description of how they felt like the hamstring injury occurred, then you can be more confident as to which muscle it is that you're actually dealing with. And when we're talking about, for example, the grade of the tear, a grade 1 tear, you can probably walk off the pitch, no problem. Grade 3 tear, when you've torn it clean off the bone, that's when you're going to be hobbling. You know you've done something right away. So prerequisites. The reason why I talk about prerequisites is because if you're sufficiently lacking in any of these three areas, then that's going to increase your risk of injury. So strength is a funny one, which I'll get onto later on. I like to see a double bodyweight RDL and progressing towards end range Nordics, but is this a cure-all? No. Just like, for example, having the mobility to do the splits 3 different ways doesn't in itself prevent you from having a hamstring injury. It's about having enough strength, and I like to think of it as the different ways you can apply and express strength rather than, for example, just being able to deadlift a certain number or achieve a Nordic. Length is also pretty important in the sense of most hamstring injuries are going to happen when you are sprinting. So when you're getting close to that full end range, especially that terminal knee extension. And finally, efficient sprinting technique. If you're heel striking massively, that's a huge braking force that you're putting through the foot, the ankle, and of course that's going to travel up the chain. So something like a double bodyweight deadlift, I would say, is a starting point. By no means is it all. We've ticked that double bodyweight deadlift box, and therefore we're not going to get any hamstring injuries. Lengthwise, I like to measure that with something called an active straight leg raise, which I'll have a picture of later on this presentation. Now, if you can score a 2 out of 3, so basically you're lying on the floor, the free leg comes up, and the ankle, if that can get past the knee, you're doing pretty well. But again, it can be considered a slightly passive test, so I like seeing this type of mobility expressed in different positions as well. So simple tests. Can you RDL 2 times body weight? Again, if you can't, no issues, but just gives you something to work towards. Again, not to say that if you get there, you're not going to get a hamstring injury, but if you can't even RDL the empty bar, then you've got issues. The picture shows a 2 out of 3 on an active straight leg raise. If you can't get, for example, that free ankle in line with the knee of the leg that's on the ground, that tells me that you've not got a sufficient ability to separate the hip that's in extension and the hip that's in flexion, which is basically what happens when we're sprinting. One leg on the ground in extension, the knee that's driving up is in flexion. So even though if it looks nothing like sprinting, it's still, for me, a worthwhile test. So mobility and stability, can you get in a position in the first place? Secondly, muscular capacity. Check out Frecklington's 2014 paper, which says that players or athletes who can't do 20 hamstring bridges with their foot elevated on a 60-centimeter box, much more likely to get injured. This is a very cheap alternative to doing something like purchasing a Nord board. So again, not a cure-all, but definitely worthwhile to have a look at. Finally, are you strong enough? Or penultimately, are you strong enough in a position? So yes, you can get in that position. Yes, you've got the muscular capacity to keep getting into that position, but how strong are you in this position? And finally, speed. Can you hit positions under speed? So we're often going to see hamstrings go towards the end of the game when players are fatigued, their movement patterns are affected. So that's why, yes, it's good to have strength. Yes, it's good to have length, but you also need an element of conditioning so that you can still be technically efficient even when you're tired. Another thing to talk about is what I call the hamstring velocity continuum. So it's very rare you see people pull hamstrings in marathon running just because the positions that the body gets in at those speeds is not really the same as what positions and stress you put the hamstring under when you are sprinting. So you have isometric hamstring work, which is basically holding static positions. So this might be something like a single leg glute ham raise where you're just holding a horizontal position. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got sprinting. If hamstrings get pulled and torn at high speed in high speed running, you need to make sure your athletes are hitting top speed at least once or twice a week, at least. And as I said, nice if you've got a heavy deadlift in you, but that's only covering such a small part of the spectrum that to say, oh, he can deadlift this amount of weight, he's not going to get hamstring injury, it's a bit short-sighted. Stuff like drop catch RDLs, so this is where, if I could re-angle the screen slightly, so if I'm performing an RDL, the weight's by my hip, and then rather than going down slowly like I normally would do with a heavy weight, I'm going to stand here with the weight, drop it, and then catch it within this RDL position. So what that's teaching, just like hamstring bridge snaps, is it's teaching your hamstring, can it relax and contract quickly, which is what it's going to keep doing when you're sprinting. And this is what my hamstring rehab protocol would look like. On one end, you start an athlete in mid-range where they're comfortable with isometrics where they're not really moving, to eventually progressing, adding speed, adding load, adding range of motion, and so eventually we're into something like sprinting where the hamstring is working eccentrically, concentrically, and isometrically. So you've not just got different ranges of motion, you've not just got different contraction types, you're also seeing, can the hamstring express strength in single leg and double leg patterns. So for example, single leg deadlift, double leg deadlift. You're also looking at whether the hamstring can fire at different speeds, as I've mentioned, and also can it be reactive, because that's what your hamstring is going to be doing ultimately when you are sprinting. And there's also something called the Quadrant of Doom. I love this as a phrase. So you've got, if your hamstrings are strong and long, that is the ideal point. That's where we've got athletes who, for example, have got the strength to handle a lot of weight in end range. So whether this is a double bodyweight RDL at full hip extension, whether this is a full range Nordic, or if you've got something called a razor curl in your locker, even better. So that's getting end range knee extension. So we've got a proximal focus, which is exercises which are hip dominant or targeting more towards the glutes. So this is exercises like your RDLs. We've also got distal focus, so this is more focus around the knee. So this is where exercises like Nordics or hamstring sliders are going to come in. If you've got players who are not just got weak hamstrings, but they're chronically tight, so they're shortened, this is a bad place to be because the injury risk spikes dramatically. Again, highly recommend checking out this paper by Timmins if you want to find out more about this. So finally, we've got Chris Bishop's holistic hamstring health infographic, which I really like. So you want to gradually progress the range of motion. So for example, let's say week 1 you're doing Nordics to a high box, so they've not got a break over the distance between where they fall from and the floor, or even simply range of motion. I don't know. By week 4 you might want a RDL where you're completely parallel to the floor, but week 2, 3 might look slightly different. You're going to gradually progress the load, so whether this is the amount of weight on the bar, whether this is how fast an athlete's able to sprint. Nordics gonna leave you particularly sore if you give your athletes them on day 1. A good coaching friend of mine, Jack Lynch, we had a chuckle when he told me about one of his swim coaches who had read an article on Nordics, saw the research and didn't consider the context and said all swimmers must be doing Nordics. So he brought this swim coach in, said, okay, demonstrate to the kids then, and fell flat on his face. So whilst there is a ton of research on Nordics, the soreness that it generates, especially if you've got athletes who have never done the exercise before, or for example don't have high levels of hamstring deconditioning, the risk and the reward, it's almost not worth it. So you can still get the same effect using hamstring sliders. So foot on a towel or on a wooden floor that's going to slide out. This is slightly less aggressive than a full Nordic. And finally, volume. Do you actually need that much hamstring volume? OPAR had a good paper, which I will chuck in the reference list if you want it, where they basically found that doing 2 sets of 4 Nordics was equally as effective as doing a much higher volume of Nordics. So once you've built that eccentric strength, you just need a little bit of volume to help you maintain it. So that's why I question whether you need to gradually progress volume once you've got your hamstrings eccentrically strong. And finally, a word on Nordics. Part of the hamstring program, not the program in itself. Yes, there's a ton of literature on Nordics, but I'm reminded of, I think it's an Einstein quote, I could be wrong, that not all things that can be measured count, and not everything that can be. No, I've ruined that. Anyway, basically, just because you can measure something doesn't mean that it matters, and just because you can't measure something doesn't mean it doesn't matter. So that should say minimal effective dose, by the way, not medium effective dose. If we can get away with doing 2 sets of 4 Nordics a week, and we've got similar effects compared to higher volume training, then let's just do that. Nordics is an end point or somewhere you get to, not somewhere you start from. The soreness they create is quite a lot. You can reduce the load of a Nordic if you like by using bands, as you can see in the picture. You can also have mats that are stacked, and you can just take a mat away each week so you can control the range of motion, which is another practicality issue with the Nordics in terms of quantifying how stressful they actually are. So key take homes: sprint 1 to 2 times a week at maximal intensity. By maximal intensity, I mean you are giving yourself full recovery. A good rule of thumb is a 1-minute rest period for every 10 meters that you've covered, so that you are definitely hitting maximum speed. There's a difference between max speed and just making yourself very tired. Hamstrings need to be long and strong, so we need to train progressively through end ranges of motion. So an RDL, where you're basically parallel to the floor, is going to help you with this. Nordics, where you're eventually working towards getting your nose to the floor without breaking it, is a nice little cue I like. And training both in knee dominant exercises and hip dominant exercises, and making sure we're doing this bilaterally, unilaterally, training across the hamstring velocity continuum. So we're not just using heavy slow exercises like Nordics and deadlifts, we're also using stuff like drop catch RDLs, drop catch single leg deadlifts, and above all, sprinting. So here's the references for those who want them. I will chase up that OPAR reference for the slide that I forgot to put it in. Hope you found this useful. If there is anything I can help you with, whether it's hamstring related or otherwise, drop me a message through your preferred platform and I would be happy to help. Thank you for listening to this week's Wisdom Wednesday.